Europe, the land of peace, prosperity, ancient rivalries, and carefully buried grudges, a continent that once set the world on fire, now bound together by trade agreements, open borders, and uneasy diplomacy. But what if all of that vanished overnight? What if Europe descended into total war, not a limited conflict, not a proxy struggle, but a brutal continent-wide fight until only one power remained? This wouldn't begin quietly. It would begin in the east. The spark would come from Russia. In a moment of calculated aggression, Moscow would attempt to crush Ukraine once and for all. A rapid offensive, overwhelming force, decisive objectives. But this wouldn't be the isolated battlefield Russia might hope for. Ukraine would not stand alone. Poland would immediately mobilize. The Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia would join without hesitation. An anti-Russian alliance would form almost instantly, driven not by ideology but survival. Russia, on the other hand, would find itself largely isolated. The first flashpoint wouldn't even be Ukraine. It would be Kaliningrad, that heavily militarized Russian exclave wedged between Poland and Lithuania, a strategic dagger pointed into NATO's heart. Poland and Lithuania would see an opportunity. They would mobilize swiftly, aiming to neutralize Kaliningrad before Russia could reinforce it. Inside Kaliningrad, Russian forces would understand the stakes. Cut off from the mainland, surrounded, outnumbered, there would be no retreat, only resistance. Moscow would attempt to send reinforcements via the Baltic Sea, but Poland and the Baltic navies would already move to deny access. Sea lanes closed, airspace contested, Kaliningrad isolated. The Russian garrison would make a bold decision: concentrate all offensive power against Lithuania, break through, force a corridor, reconnect with Russian forces advancing from the east. The assault would be ferocious. Lithuanian defenses would buckle under the initial shock. Towns would fall. Lines would bend, but they would not break. Lithuania would stabilize, Poland would strike from the south, and the Kaliningrad forces would be squeezed from two sides. Eventually, the enclave would fall. Moscow's response would be immediate and furious. Belarus would be ordered into the war. Now, the conflict would truly ignite. Russia's new strategy would be simple: overwhelm the Baltics from two axes, direct invasion from Russian territory, and a secondary thrust through Belarus. Estonia would be targeted first. Fast strikes, heavy artillery, air superiority attempts. Poland, committed to the defense of its northern neighbors, would rush troops forward. And that would be the fatal mistake. Russian forces operating from Belarus would strike Polish supply lines, encircling much of the Baltic defense force. A second Polish column would attempt to break the encirclement, but Belarusian forces, anticipating the move, would block the relief. The Baltic armies would be trapped. They would fight to the last, but isolation would doom them. Estonia would fall. Then Latvia. Lithuania would follow soon after. Russian troops would advance westward, retaking Kaliningrad and stabilizing their front. Now, only Poland and Ukraine would remain standing against Russia in the east. Poland would fortify heavily around Kaliningrad and its eastern border. Ukraine, however, would bear the brunt of the next assault. Russia would launch a massive offensive into Ukraine. Initial gains in the south would stretch Ukrainian defenses thin. Kyiv would become the decisive objective. The battle for Kyiv would erupt, a grinding, attritional struggle. Ukrainian forces would spread themselves across multiple fronts, gambling that Allied reinforcements might arrive in time. Only minimal units would guard the Belarusian border. Russia would exploit that weakness. A push from Belarus would attempt to flank Ukrainian positions, but Polish forces, still intact, would intervene, preventing immediate collapse. For weeks, neither side would move significantly. Then Russia would break through in the south. The Ukrainian line would fracture. Territory would fall rapidly. Encirclements would form. A final massive offensive would crush organized resistance. Kiev would fall. Ukraine would collapse. Survivors would flee west into Poland. Others would be captured. Eastern Europe would now stand on the brink. Poland would find itself alone. Despite preparing defensive positions, Poland would be severely outmatched. Russia, though bloodied, would regroup and launch another offensive. Kaliningrad would be retaken fully. Russian forces would begin pushing into Polish territory itself. Poland would search desperately for allies. None would arrive in time. Under relentless pressure, Poland would fall. Eastern Europe would now be under Russian control. But victory would come at immense cost. Casualties would be staggering, equipment losses severe. Russia would pause, consolidate, integrate Belarus formally, prepare for the next stage of continental domination. Meanwhile, in the West, another power would rise. Germany? With Eastern Europe destabilized and France wary, Berlin would decide the time had come to assert dominance. The first targets would be the Benelux countries, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg. German mobilization would be swift and overwhelming. Mechanized columns would surge across borders. The Netherlands would collapse quickly. Belgium and Luxembourg would fall soon after. France would recall its forces, abandoning its smaller allies to secure its own territory. The Franco-German border would ignite. Paris, dangerously close to the German frontier, would become the central objective. German forces would focus their assault there, punching through defensive lines. French troops would attempt to hold the capital. The battle would be decisive and devastating. Germany would prevail. Paris would fall. French forces would regroup in the south, attempting a counter-offensive. For a brief moment, it would appear as though momentum might shift. German lines would bend. Then Germany would reorganize and unleash a crushing counter-strike, tearing through southern defenses. France would fall. Germany would expand further. Austria would be pressured to join and would refuse. German forces would invade. Austria would resist fiercely, even gaining temporary success. The Czech Republic would intervene in support of Austria. For a moment, Germany would appear vulnerable. Then, elite German units would be deployed. The Czech counterattack would be pushed back. Austria would be defeated. The Czech Republic would follow. Germany would dominate Central and Western Europe. Across the Channel, Ireland would attempt to exploit British distraction, launching an offensive to reclaim Northern Ireland. Initial surprise would give them momentum, but the United Kingdom would regroup, splitting its forces and counterattacking from multiple directions. Ireland's gamble would fail. In Scandinavia, Finland would strike first, targeting Sweden. Finnish forces would initially succeed, overwhelming defenses. Sweden would fall. Finland would then move west into Norway. Norway, desperate, would propose a shocking alliance, offering territory to both Germany and Russia in exchange for assistance. Germany would accept, rapidly seizing Denmark. Russia would accept as well. But instead of merely assisting, Russian forces would devastate Finland, tearing through its territory. Finland would collapse, Norway would briefly believe itself secure. But in total war, security is an illusion. Now Europe would stand divided between two colossal blocks, a Russian-dominated East and a German-dominated West. Two exhausted, bloodied superpowers, and eventually, inevitably, they would turn toward each other. Total war would reach its final phase, and Europe would burn once again.